is feeling like you're losing momentum, pressing off of the chest, it feels like maybe your shoulders are getting a little scrunched up and like you don't have enough space, or you just feel like you could get a little bit more out of it, there's a few tips that I want you to think about whenever you go to try your next overhead press. The first tip is your base. So I think sometimes folks will set up really narrow, but in general, the most powerful position for your feet when you're in a standing position, squatting is a little bit different, but if you just jump and land, that is a very powerful position for your body to produce force from the floor. So here, mine's a little bit wider than hip distance. This is a very nice, stable base. Here, it's kind of harder for me to feel connected to the floor. So you can just widen your stance a little bit. The second thing is, where do I put my trunk? Where do I put my torso? So sometimes folks don't have the thoracic mobility to get into an appropriate overhead position. Or even more commonly, they don't lack the proprioception, they don't lack the awareness to get into a proper overhead position. So I would say you can do some thread the needles or thoracic rotations, or like lie on the floor and do some twists to open up the area in between your shoulder blades. Most people have sufficient mobility, but you need to work on awareness. So you will think about, and there's a little bit of extension that has to happen with the overhead press. But if the ribs are flaring quite a bit and the butt sticks out, it's really hard to generate power and it feels really unstable. So we want to bring the rib cage in and we want to squeeze the glutes. So even though my chest is lifted and I am in a little bit of an extension, my ribs are pulled down and my abs are turned on. So that's the second thing to think about when you're trying to troubleshoot your overhead press. The third thing is hand grip width. So similarly to people will often set themselves up really narrow, people will set their hands really narrow. So if I just go at shoulder distance, I'm really closed off here. I can't use my lats. I really have to generate a lot of force, and then my shoulders feel really crunchy at the top, like I don't quite have enough space. So in general, most folks do better when they do one thumb distance from the smooth, maybe a little bit narrower, depending on like if you're a smaller person with longer fingers. But instead of shoulder distance, I do like to go just a little bit wider. And what that lets me do is I can create kind of like a shelf with my lats. I've got space in my armpit, my mid back is really strong, I've got that strong lat shelf, and it's easier for me to generate that force. So what do I mean when I say lat shelf? This right here. So if I'm all closed off, I can't flex my lat and my shoulder is going to be crunched forward a little bit. If I open my armpit angle, I can stack this here, stabilize my shoulder, and generate more power in my overhead press off of the chest. The fourth and final thing to look at is your elbow position. This takes practice, especially if you're newer to overhead pressing. So a lot of people will start their overhead press with their elbows back here. If I press, I'm going forward and then I have to make up that distance. And it's a really inefficient bar path. So to make things more efficient, we want to either get our elbows right underneath the bar, or if we have the ability, we're going into, so here's a front rack position, like for Olympic lifting. We don't need to go this high, but elbows slightly in front of the bar. If your mobility eventually allows for it, that's the optimal position. But as long as you can get your elbows under the bar, then you're fine. So I'm going to do a couple of reps so you can see the difference. So here, I've got my elbows behind the bar, and I have to do a lot of maneuvering of my torso to get into the right position. Here, my elbows are right underneath the bar. It's more efficient. I don't have to move my torso. And here, my chest is in a big extension. I can really brace my abs. That's super efficient. And if I ever wanted to mess around with jerks or push press, that gets me in a really solid front rack position to be able to do those more explosive movements.